Well, you keep saying I got kicked out of Texas. I'm going to start believing it. It's not true. That part's not true. I enjoyed thoroughly my time at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum. The director, Carol Lovelady, is here, and Emily Quinn, who is the curator of art there now, she'll help answer any questions you have about the early Texas art collection there at Panhandle Plains, and just see her after the lecture. I'm sure she's already up to speed. I was gratified that the invitation for the symposium at the Whitty, that's next month, and I hope you've all put that on your calendar. 3 of the 9 images on the cover are at Panhandle Plains. I'm very proud of that. Very proud of that. My passport still works when I cross the Red River, evidently, so because I'm here. But I want to take away for just a second. If you're a veteran, would you please stand and be recognized? One of the areas of study that I got to participate in at Panhandle Plains before I left was World War I, and we're still honoring the centennial of World War I, in fact, the Forgotten War, and we will be honoring that centennial until 2022 because the last U.S. troops don't come home until 1922. So thank a veteran whenever you see them, and thank you veterans for standing and being recognized. I listened to a lot of Waylon Jennings in Oklahoma because that's important, and so remember, it don't matter who's in Austin, Bob Wills is still the king. That's important to remember. Most of you who know me know that sometimes I'm a bit provocative in the things that I do and the exhibitions that we put together at Panhandle Plains, some of the things I've written and published. And the title of my talk was Intentionally Provocative, and if I've not made a couple of dealers angry by the time I'm done, then I haven't done my job very well. And likewise with the museum folks, and I hope that'll happen. Can we turn the lights down? Is that possible? So you can actually see the screen? That sure be nice. Thank you. I appreciate it. At Panhandle Plains, there are about a half dozen Salinas paintings in the collection. And in doing the research for Texas Impressionism, the exhibition that toured the state in 2012, some of you may recall that exhibition, which spawned a second exhibition on Jose Arpa, where we kind of bent the normal understanding of what Mr. Arpa did to contribute to early Texas art, likewise with the Texas Impressionism exhibition as well. And one of the things that I never got to do at Panhandle Plains, but I hope somebody will, and that's one of the reasons for my talk, is to hopefully provoke someone to take on this question. I heard it throughout my career, and I've worked on Texas art since 1985. I actually spoke at the very first CASETA conference. I believe it was at the Fort Worth Modern Art Museum, if I'm not mistaken, and I talked about A.C. Cook as a collector. And Mr. Cook used to use an expression called, when he'd come across something that was quite fantastic, he'd say, "That's a national treasure." Well, in fact, he had a few national treasures, and I'm going to show you one here in just a few minutes. But I have to recognize that my colleagues in the museum world and also in the academic world, we tend to be snobs. We can be real snobs, especially when we're gatekeepers on what artists are acceptable and which artists do we take seriously. And that's really the motivation for this particular talk. And I need to warn you that when you give a microphone in 30 minutes, he's going to want more time. So fair warning. So if you're not dashing for the alcohol when I'm done, then I haven't done a very good job. So Porfirio Salinas, serious artist or potboiler painter. Most of you probably have an idea what a potboiler is, and that's been the question and the challenge with Salinas the whole time I worked on Texas art, and that continues regardless of which side of the Red River I'm on. I always have Texas art in my heart. It's in my soul, and it's a spiritual journey for me as well. But I want to tell you a little story about how the market and art historians and curators directly affect how we see certain artists. There once was an artist of Spanish descent who became hugely popular in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century. So much so that his work couldn't be sold fast enough in the United States. And museum curators, as they often do, sometimes get caught up in the fact that the market is somehow a divisive force in taking an artist seriously. And that artist's work was relegated to museum vaults and museum storage areas for decades, up until just about the last 20 years. That artist name is Martin Rico. Martin Rico is germane to our talk today because he was a direct influence on Jose Arpa. Martin Rico's work only recently has been resurrected from the museum storage vaults where his work has languished for decades, as we start to take him more seriously by using connoisseurship, and that's the key to my talk today, is connoisseurship. Looking at works of art and deciding whether they are serious or not. And in some cases, the answer is not going to be no. So Martin Rico is part of my talk, and we had a very fine painting of his at Panhandle Plains, as you can see here, and it was actually the first conservation project I undertook when I was the art curator there, and eventually it gave rise to other things, and especially an examination of Jose Arpa. The Meadows Museum, the largest Spanish art collection outside New York City here in the U.S., only recently acquired a Martin Rico, and so Rico has suddenly been resurrected. In other words, the market dictated, allegedly, how art historians looked at his work. Now, museum administrators and curators and directors and so on, as well as academics, have also had an effect here in Texas. Many of you may recognize Frank Ray's Breezing Morning, and I know a couple of things about Mr. Ray. And when this painting was discovered in a barn in Iowa and came to auction or was headed to auction, I called a director of a major art museum here in Texas, knowing that they collected in this particular realm, and I said, as far as I know, this is probably the largest and most significant Ray oil that will come on the market ever again. Now, I mean oil painting now. I don't mean the pastels, because there are a few still out there. And he dutifully took it to his board of directors and came back and told me that the answer was, now remember, this is a frontline art museum here in this state. The answer was, we would never pay a dime for a Frank Ray painting. We'd take it as a gift, possibly. So, as I said, the market sometimes, and art historians can be snobs. So, Porfirio Salinas. A couple of photographs of him here, and for full disclosure, I've been studying Salinas for a while, but I'm not his biographer. Pete's working on that, as you heard before, so we'll have to rely on Pete. But Porfirio Salinas is the artist that I'm talking about today, keeping in mind the things that I just told you. And of course, his popularity, in my opinion, has been an albatross, an anchor in many respects, particularly on the academic level and particularly with museum collections and exhibitions. While we included one of his paintings in Texas Impressionism, as far as being considered a serious artist, I know of no art historians who've really taken that on. And his popularity allegedly due and brought to a national forefront while LBJ was president played a role in that. He's even been on Antiques Roadshow, as you can see. And what other sort of motivation do you need to give an artist legitimacy than to be on Antiques Roadshow? So why aren't museums recognizing Porfirio Salinas? They are on a certain level, and we have the Whitty Museum in 2010 to thank for this exhibition of 22 of his paintings. Amy Fulkerson, probably here, I did not see her yet, but she's responsible for not only the 2010 show, but the CASETA award-winning exhibition in 2013 and 14, when they installed one of his murals that he painted for Las Pintas Ranch, and installed the easel paintings on the outside. That's a pretty forward-thinking type of exhibition installation, but it also tells us about his flexibility as an artist, not only easel paintings, but also murals and even room decor, and that flexibility is something we're going to talk about now. So, let's say a 3.5 by 7 painting of longhorns in a Texas landscape showed up. Y'all be lining up to buy one. You would, because you probably figure you know who the artist is. But you take out the longhorns and you see this. This is where connoisseurship comes into play. Who's the artist and can he paint? That's the key. So a serious artist who can paint things like this, and you compare them to Mr. Arpa, and you see this lovely painting that's in the Dallas Museum of Art collection. A similar scene, a similar landscape, similar treatment, and skill level almost equal. Likewise, another Porfirio Salinas painting of shadows in a bluebonnet landscape, and you see another one that's by Julian Onderdonk in the Ogden Museum in New Orleans. A sunset scene, possibly similar to other sunset scenes by an early Texas artist we all know and admire. How about a landscape which has a sort of characteristic trees at the center foreground? Walton Leader, one of our celebrated early Texas artists, L.O. Griffith. We all recognize this painting, and even Julian Onderdonk, who also used this same sort of composition. All considered serious artists. Paintings of rocks along the Pedernales. How about Lundquist, 19th century artist doing the same sort of thing. Seascapes, and who comes to mind but of course Paul Schumann, and Salinas could do those too. So are his works, his wildflower landscapes, are they masterworks? Are they room decoration? Do they belong in a furniture store and not on a museum gallery wall? That's the challenge for art historians and for collectors. And then we see things like this. Also by his brush, when he's trying to make a living. And it's easy for art historians to use sneering derision when we're talking about someone who's simply trying to survive, or in fact under the thumb perhaps of a gallery that demands a new type of painting following the same formula every single day. We know about his alcoholism. Whether he considered himself an alcoholic or not is irrelevant, but I do know this personally. I lost my grandfather, I lost an uncle, and I lost my brother last year to this terrible disease. Here's what I know about the alcoholic. The only thing they think about is the next drink, period. And you do what you do until you can get to the next drink. Whether that affected his work or not, I don't know. But potboilers, trying to satisfy a particular demand, even allowing your work to be reproduced on china, perhaps as a way to put beans on the table. He could paint missions, of course. He was a Texas artist. What Texas artist didn't paint missions? He could paint Mexican dance scenes or folklore scenes. He could paint bullfights. But look at the bullfight painting to the right. When he was on, he was really on. So the potboilers, are they just a distraction? I'm not sure. So are these potboilers Spanish folk life scenes? I don't know. But he could also do Old West, as you can see. Cowboy scenes, right? Winter wolves, red barn. Cow work. What good Texas artist couldn't do that? Remember, there are no cowboys in early Texas art. Until there are, by the way. A couple of more. And I like to think that Mr. Salinas was a little more sophisticated than we give him credit for. So that perhaps in satisfying that thumb of the market demand, perhaps he was thinking in a more sophisticated way about art history. And perhaps Thomas Eakins, when he journeyed out to the American West and painted things like this, perhaps informed what Salinas was doing in something that we might consider a potboiler. Even singing cowboys, I mean, who can't enjoy that? And of course, we know Mr. Eakins did the same sort of thing when he went out west into the Badlands. Horse portraits, pet portraits, livestock portraits, a big deal, especially in the hill country in the 1950s. Olive Vandruff, Harold Bugby's widow, that's how she made her living, was pet portraits and livestock portraits. And so Mr. Salinas did them as well. Seascapes, as I showed you before. And of course his well-known autumnals, often coming with a nice velvet liner to really enhance the power of the picture, especially if it was framed as nicely as this. And of course, bluebonnets, 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 bluebonnets. And when I flew in from Oklahoma City today, I really appreciate that the Austin airport planted wildflowers all over the tarmac because they're all in bloom. I don't know if any of y'all noticed that, but there are bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and verbena all around the tarmac. So applause to the Austin Chamber of Commerce for doing that sort of thing. And of course, he painted murals, large-scale paintings. This is 100 inches wide. Here's another one that's at the Whitty. And of course, also as background for a diorama in the Buckhorn Saloon. And this is a great story because this mural eventually stayed in the old Buckhorn Saloon building, but that building burned just a few years ago. And you can see the Salinas painting there in the back, I think. Yeah, there you go. There's the painting right there. I love this. Winched out with a crane, set on the back of a flatbed panel truck, and reinstalled at the Whitty. Absolutely, absolutely. And most of our frontline artists that we celebrate and we honor and we get out the kneeling rails to, guess what? Georgia O'Keeffe did commercial art too. Oh yeah, so did Winslow Homer and Thomas Moran. So putting beans on the table is something that you do, right? It's just part of the equation. So this is all leading up to a little compare contrast that I'm about to do, but I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the signature and the great debate over Salinas' signature, because if it doesn't have the first initial, then it's X. If it doesn't have the first initial, or it has the first initial, then it's dated then. And if it has a horizontal line next to the signature, then it's then. Look at the picture. Is the painting any good? We're not buying signatures. We're not hanging signatures on the walls of our galleries. We're supposed to be supporting the advancement and study of early Texas art. If the painting's no good, it's no good. Everybody had a bad day, and everybody painted potboilers, believe it or not. And of course, there's the old thin paint controversy. Here we go, same painting, light shining through it. He barely applied any paint. Perhaps there were reasons due to his addiction. I don't know. But we need to keep those things in mind. And it was really fun to curate this talk, truly curate it, because many of you were very generous in sharing your images. And if I didn't use your particular painting you sent me and I hurt your feelings, I'm sorry, I'm not responsible for that. Okay, so how did he get to becoming a serious painter or a potboiler painter? Near San Antonio, of course, growing up near San Antonio and Austin, he would have been exposed to Spanish colonial painting and, of course, the missions that were there. And great paintings by these Spanish colonial artists, early Mexican Republic artists who were emulating the Spanish masters that they knew in the church paintings that he would have seen, including Mexican painting, as I mentioned before, Our Lady of Guadalupe, you see here. And other sources included, of course, popular Mexican arts like restaurant calendars. And of course, Austin has some of the best Tex-Mex restaurants around and had some of the greatest calendars. And try to find them now. They're highly collectible, as you can see. But who were the figures here in the area who informed his work before we think we know the direction that he took? Seymour Thomas, of course, from San Augustine, Texas, who came periodically in the latter part of the 1890s to make sketches while he was in San Antonio before he settled back into his life abroad and before he returned to Texas. Lucian Abrams. We did an exhibition on Lucian Abrams a few years back, and Lucian Abrams was very much a member of the Impressionist school in Old Lyme, Connecticut. And so Salinas would have seen his work because Abrams had a home in San Antonio up until his death in 1941. So his work was available and he would have seen it. Dawson Watson, of course, was one of the big names in the San Antonio area, and his well-known prickly pear paintings were everywhere. And of course, being an award winner at the Davis competitions, which I'll get to in just a minute, they would have been available for Salinas to see. And of course, the giant, who is Julian Onderdonk, who is in New York for a better part of the early part of the 20th century, returns to Texas in 1909. And of course, he dies in 1922, but his work's everywhere. And he also painted potboilers, folks. He sold them paintings off cigar lids on the corner of San Antonio so they could eat. Does that make them bad paintings? Some of them aren't so great. He used a pseudonym, as you know from James Baker's book. He used a pseudonym to make a living. It's easy for us to judge from the high perch, but the man who really influenced him as much as any was one of two, and that was Jose Arpa. And as you know from the exhibition, if you got to see Jose Arpa or you read the catalog, you know that one of the things he brought to Texas was Spanish art history. And he brought Spanish art history for Salinas to know as well. Paintings by El Greco, obviously not in original form, but certainly that Spanish tradition of which Porfirio Salinas was part. Diego Velázquez, who was born in and worked in Seville, where Jose Arpa came from. Goya, of course. Murillo, one of the great spiritual painters that we see works emulated by, especially in Spanish colonial Texas. Murillo's work is where he can see it. And of course, Fortuny, who is one of the great informers of Arpa's work, and Arpa's work is largely indoctrinated in this particular painting style, tenebrismo, something like that. I can't say the word exactly, but it's about making the paint surface sparkle. Something Salinas learned as well from the lessons he learned about Fortuny through Jose Arpa. But just to make sure we have the biography correct, we remember a couple of years ago that we determined that the famous painting of Acapulco Boy by Lloyd Goff, we determined that he was a direct descendant of Mariano Fortuny. I'd like to put to rest today that Porfirio Salinas was not a direct descendant and never worked as an Acapulco boy, although his admirable head of hair lasted him throughout his life, almost as good as Pete Ranoni's. But we'll put that rumor to rest right now. So Martin Rico was also brought to Salinas' attention, of course, through Jose Arpa. And you can see the effect of the mastery of painting light on water that Rico had in his own work that was transformed into what Arpa could do in his own work. Joaquin Sorolla, of course, was hugely popular in the United States, especially in the 1890s and once again in the 19-teens. And of course, his work would have been available to Salinas, but particularly brought to the attention to Salinas by Mr. Arpa, whose own paintings in Sorolloismo and paintings of Seville, the fair at Seville, were things that Salinas could have seen, as well as Arpa's own work in Mexico while he was there in the latter part of the 19th century, Arpa's paintings in other parts of the United States, especially in the Southwest. And I'll stop here on this particular Arpa painting because if you've not seen this painting, and there are works of art that should stop you in your tracks. They really should. And I spoke about this when we toured the Arpa exhibition around the state. And when I first saw this, it actually came, and this is a bit of an exaggeration. It came in the back of a pickup, not exactly, but kinda, to Panhandle Plains, and I hung it on the wall. And it's one of those things that stopped me in my tracks. And I stood and looked at it for a very long time, about a half an hour or so. And if you really nail a Texas cut bank like he did here, especially this agave plant growing out, the way that Arpa did, you can smell it. You can hear it. You can feel the paint, you can taste the caliche dust. That's what Arpa did here. And ultimately it informs what Porfirio Salinas could do. And of course, Arpa was a master at wildflower paintings, winning early prizes, the Texas prize at the first Davis competition. And of course, he's part of that Davis competition, and Davis competition was around beginning in 1927, as we know from Dr. Reeves's excellent book. In 1927 through 29, Salinas was 17, 18, and 19 years old when those are being shown in San Antonio. And one wonders if he could have gained admission to the Whitty Museum at that time. I don't know. That might be a question for another scholar at some time. But he certainly was exposed to this type of work. And we know, of course, that Arpa had a great effect on his students and proteges, as we see in this comparison between Arpa and Carl Hoppe, comparison between Arpa and Rolla Taylor. But I think in many ways, one of the artists who's had a greater effect on Salinas in a different kind of way than most scholars have recognized is Robert Wood. Robert Wood was British. And the British landscape aesthetic is different from the Spanish landscape aesthetic. And we'll walk through that very briefly, but keep these things in mind. And I want you to come away today with questions in your mind. What do you see in a Salinas painting? Who do you see in a Salinas painting? What traditions do you see? With Robert Wood, of course, we think we know his work as well. He was just as prolific. He painted under pseudonyms as well. He painted potboilers too. They all did at one time or another. But he was a master. And so I posit that Robert Wood brought the great English painters to the attention of Porfirio Salinas, such as John Constable. When a quaint scene of a mill by a stream wasn't a subject for derisive sneers by art historians and museum curators. A cabin in the woods wasn't a throwaway line for painting. So think about that when you see Salinas. He also, I believe, probably made Salinas aware of Thomas Cole, the so-called father of the Hudson River School. And Thomas Cole, of course, made his living in America. And he painted in the Adirondacks. And one of the things that Cole was known to have said was, we must get away from the specific and allow the veil of time to obscure the details. And therefore, his paintings are composites. You cannot walk to a spot where a Thomas Cole painting was made or depicts. The same is true of Porfirio Salinas, because I believe that he took these lessons to heart. His field sketches, Constable's field sketches and Cole's field sketches in pencil, Constable less so, but Cole would make color notes and tell what color things were. He didn't sketch in the field with a small box, a thumb box, or a small box of watercolors. He sketched in pencil and made himself very careful pencil notes so he could allow that veil of time to obscure the details, and he could create paintings. He wasn't making color photographs, to quote Grant Wood. He was making memories, as was Porfirio Salinas. So look at this sketch here by Porfirio Salinas. I guarantee you, if this wasn't up here, you would probably think that was an English landscape drawing and compare it to a coal field sketch. Same kind of color notes going on. When he's initially going out painting on his own or working in tandem with Jose Arpa or with Robert Wood, the looseness of the brush, and something that everyone talks about how loose the brush is, but then you have the signature, of course, then the controversy comes in. This is 1929. He's 19 years old. This is fantastic field painting, and it falls right into the playbook of not the Spanish school and not the English school, but it falls into the French school. The early plein air sketches by the French painter. So this artist is far more sophisticated than we've given him credit for. And as William H. Gertz says, the definition of an impressionist is comma-like brushstrokes that cover the surface and often catch the light and glitter. And that's a paraphrase. But that's what you see in his earliest paintings. He's 29 years old here. Huizache Bend. And I believe this painting is actually in one of the galleries, and I'm not going to point out who it is. You'll have to go on your own hunt. But that painting is easy, Charlie. So we use our connoisseurship as we look at the different types of paintings he did beyond the bluebonnets. Huizache and prickly pear. Prickly pear compared to Arpa. And this fantastic piece with its original frame. And another Arpa, or another Salinas prickly pear, where he much like Arpa did in the previous painting, pushes the prickly pear almost completely out of the picture plane so it occupies our space. This was very forward thinking. This is daring, and Salinas is doing it too when we get to here. It becomes part of our space as well, something he's learning about trompe-l'oeil as he works. And, of course, the greatest prickly pear painter we can think of usually is Dawson Watson. See how it prepares. See how it compares. And what greater legacy for an early Texas art than to pass the baton to the next generation, such as Noe Perez, who sings the songs of Salinas every time you talk to him. And I was fortunate enough to run into him in Corpus Christi last month. And over a couple of cervezas, we talked about Salinas and how much it meant for Noe to know his work and to see his work as a kid from time to time when he got to San Antonio. So you see paintings like this. This is the piece that we had in the Texas Impressionism exhibition. And seeing that water and wondering how it got to that place brings us to the field sketches and also to the influences on his work. So compare Rico and Arpa and Salinas, the traditions that he learned in depicting water on a Texas river. And the field sketches that went into that and the choices that were made to make these great paintings were all Salinas's and informed Salinas. And a caliche bank on the San Marcos River brings us back to Arpa once again when you can smell it. You can smell what it feels like on a hot day like that here in Texas. But we think of other paintings that we put on pedestals by Paul Schumann, an almost identical scene. And he's really just slinging paint when he's in his prime, when he's really moving. Before whatever it was that crippled him, whether it was pressure from the market or addiction, he could really sling the paint. This is a small field sketch at Panhandle Plains that's this big. Maybe one of my favorite paintings in the collection. There are about 600 other paintings by another artist named Ray. I kind of like those too, but the Salinas is awful good. It's awful good. So back to the bullfight painting. What level of sophistication did Salinas really have? We've seen the bullfight paintings, and some of them are just awful. They're awful, terrible. But then you see this. Power in the drawing, and this is about a 7x10 drawing. Not a very big thing. So who was informing him? Probably bullfight calendars or posters, as you see here, more than likely, because commercial art is very much part of his playbook. He's absorbing sources from wherever he can find them. But what about this? Mariano Fortuny, probably when the bullfight was a very much a measured part of the Spanish painting book. And what about this? Notice the gesture in the Salinas drawing that follows very much in what Picasso was doing with the bullfight as well. And this is actually an image that was on the back of this painting when it was sold at auction, and you can see the similarities. It's almost inescapable that his knowledge was much broader than we give him credit for. And Picasso's work, especially in the 1950s, when he became his own rock star, when Picasso was on the cover of Life magazine every time you got your new issue, Salinas could not be unaware of who he was. And could he be aware even of early Mexican painting by the great Diego Rivera, whose influence in Texas has been reaffirmed and reaffirmed and reaffirmed? Could Salinas not have escaped that? So, A.C. Cook, as I mentioned before, often used the phrase national treasure. We hosted the Hawk Shop collection at Panhandle Plains, I want to say about 1990 or 91. And when he unboxed this painting, I'd never seen it before. And most of the paintings that I showed you today, I haven't seen in person. So I will challenge you to, before you make judgments about any artist, you need to see the work in person. So Road to Hondo is something you need to see in person. This is my personal all-time top 10 Texas paintings, bar none. Because you can smell it. You can hear it. You can feel it. And a little piece of that caliche is about to crumble into the road. And only a master like Porfirio Salinas, in my book, in this art historian's book, in this curator's book, only he could do that because he was informed by masters. He carried the baton very skillfully. One more reminder, Jose Arpa played a key role in that, as did Robert Wood and all the artists that they carried forward with him. So, how's that for a comparison? About roads in Texas, about one of the artists who justifiably is on one of the pedestals in museum exhibitions every time we have one in Texas. So does Road to Hondo compare at all to Road to Rome in a different kind of aesthetic than we've come to embrace with Texas regionalism? Texas painterly painters like Porfirio Salinas, do they not deserve at least equal attention and examination? That's the challenge. So, in borrowing a phrase from my colleague, Eleanor Jones Harvey, from last year's CASETA, I'll conclude with Porfirio Salinas. Why the hell not? Thank you. Yes, sir.
What is the size of this painting?
It's 30 by 40, if I remember correctly.
I have a question. What were the pseudonyms that Porfirio Salinas painted under?
Pseudonyms? Did I say he painted under pseudonyms? Robert Wood did. Robert Wood did, but I don't think Salinas ever did. Not that I'm aware of, and I may be wrong. Pete could probably answer that better than me. I don't know of a pseudonym. But he did. He was just so versatile is what I was trying to get at. I'm sorry if I don't answer your question. Yes, ma'am.
Is it true that he would bring his paintings to the airfield here in Austin, and Lyndon B. Johnson would come and look at the paintings and buy them?
That's entirely possible. But you know, urban legend on Salinas, I think, clouds his legacy far more than any Texas artist that I know, really. I mean, it makes for a good story, and I guess it ought to be true. But I don't know if it should be true. I don't know. That's entirely possible, sure. Did I make anybody mad? And if I didn't, then I failed. I hope I made you think. That's really what I wanted. I wanted you to think. Charlie.
At what point in his career did the alcohol problems start affecting his works, in your opinion?
You know, and this is from someone who has direct experience with alcoholism. Nobody's born wanting to be an alcoholic. But usually they are from their first breath, and they usually become an alcoholic when their first drink. So we really can't determine that. Once that happens, and they're on that road to addiction, then that's all. That's it. You know. So how it affected his work, that's for anybody's guess. But it boils down to connoisseurship, and also a proper and well-researched biography. And I know Pete and Gregory are going to do that.